This is Mr. Dreyer over at Minchville High School with another AP Government lesson. Today we're going to talk about the most important thing this year, which is the Constitution. First of all, let's look at the AP curriculum. Here is the enduring understanding. The Constitution created a competitive policy-making process to ensure the people's will is represented and that freedom is preserved. We'll talk about what that really means. Down here, we have to talk about different powers the government has in the Constitution. And probably not in this video, but in the later one, we'll talk about Federalist 51, which is another foundational document that you need to know. So, before we get into the details of the Constitution, I wanted to show you this. Right here, this shows you the constitutions of different countries when they were ratified, and also how many words are in them. I wanted to show you this because it's important to understand that the United States Constitution is actually not very long. It's a brief outline. It's only around 8,000 words. Look at this down here. Some constitutions are 140,000 words, 66,000 words. These things are very long. They're detailed. They tell every single power the government has. So what can we really get from this? Why is the U.S. Constitution so short? Well, the basic idea is that it is an outline. And what that means is that future generations have a lot of leeway and flexibility deciding what things mean in the Constitution. The only reason I point that out is because today, and in fact in every age, people will always say, well, it's in the Constitution. Well, that is true. But sometimes things are in the Constitution in a vague way. Sometimes that's on purpose, because the framers or the founders knew that people change over time, societies change over time, and therefore the Constitution might be interpreted in different ways over time. The Constitution is broken into 7 articles. An article, think of it as a chapter in a book. So we have 1 to 7. Although I use Roman numerals, in the Constitution they use Roman numerals. Each article, each chapter, focuses on one specific part of the government. The very first article is probably the most important article in the Constitution because it talks about the legislative branch. Now, you may have heard people talk about how all 3 branches are equal in power and they were created equally. Well, today all 3 branches are moderately equal in power. That is true. But back when the Constitution was written, the framers of the Constitution really felt the legislative branch was the most important branch. Now, that is because it is the branch that really directly represents the people. And we have to remember it's bicameral. There are 2 houses. The upper house is the Senate. Every state gets 2 senators. The lower house is the House of Representatives. Every state gets representatives based on population. So Article 1 talks about, first of all, who can be in the legislative branch. What is the composition? It's going to lay out basic facts like it's bicameral. It has a Senate. It has a House. It talks about what are the qualifications for the people to be a senator or a representative. And then in the last part of Article 1, it talks about the powers. So yet again, Article 1 talks about the legislative branch. It describes what it is, and it describes how people are elected to office. And then it describes the powers that they have as a national legislative body. So, we know it's bicameral. Yet again, it has the Senate and the House of Representatives. We know that each state gets representatives based on population. So some states will only get 1 representative. Some states will get many more. Virginia gets 11. California gets 53. Now, to be exact, in the Constitution it says a state will get one representative for every 30,000 people. So if a state has 30,000 people, they get one representative. If they have 60,000 or more, they get two, and so on. This entire system was changed in the late 1900s because they had to cap how many representatives there are total. And I'm going to get into that in a different lesson because it's kind of complicated. But the fact of the matter is, every 10 years there was a census. Every state, they would count up the population, and then they would divide it by 30,000, and that's how many representatives you got. Unless you're in a state with a large slave population back then, they were counted as 3/5, which we already went over. Of course, the 3/5 all changed after the Civil War, and the 13th Amendment, which granted slaves freedom. So, if we kept adding people to the House of Representatives right now, based on the population of the U.S., which is over 300 million people, the House of Representatives should have over 10,000 representatives. As you can see, there is a point in time where a legislative body gets too big to conduct business, and that is why they put a cap on it. All right, and we'll talk about that later. Representatives are elected every 2 years at the state level, and the states can basically make criteria for the elections and who can vote. So keep in mind, states still have some power in this system. States can set voting requirements. Now, obviously, nowadays, they can't bar people from voting based on race or religion, but back then, a state could do anything they want. Some states said, well, you can vote every 2 years, but you have to be a man. Remember, women could not vote. Some states said you have to be a man and you have to own 20 acres of land or 30 acres, so they also had land requirements. So when the Constitution was first ratified, even most white males could not vote in most states because they did not own enough land. And one big idea I talk about is over time, more people have been able to participate in voting because obviously of amendments in the Constitution and as our society has changed. At a certain point, nobody needed to own land to vote. Okay, so democracy has definitely widened and been more inclusive over time in the US. Now, originally, a representative had to be 25 years old. Okay? Senators had to be 30 years old. The senators served a 6-year term. So right away, we see a difference. Representatives, a 2-year term. Senators, a 6-year term. Senators are older. The idea is that senators in the upper house are more experienced. Senators are seen as more prestigious. There's only 100 senators, whereas there's 435 representatives today. And think about that. As soon as a representative gets elected, they have to think about getting re-elected. Now, in a different unit, we'll go into the entire election process. All right, what else does Article 1 say? And by the way, I put a nice little chart in here for you to study. Currently, there are 435 reps, 100 senators, age requirements, the term, plus you have to live in the U.S. for a certain period of time. So if you move to the U.S. right now legally and you become a naturalized citizen, you would still have to live here 7 years before you could be a representative. You would have to live here 9 years before you could be a senator. In Article 1, they talk about the structure of the House of Representatives and the Senate. They say that the House of Representatives can elect their own leader. So they can elect the Speaker of the House. That is the person that is elected by these 435 people to be in charge. Now, normally it's going to be somebody from the majority party. What that means is right now there are more Democrats in the House of Representatives, and they elected Nancy Pelosi as the Speaker. She is a Democrat from California. In the Senate, it's a little bit different. The President of the Senate actually is the Vice President of the United States. And really, the President can only do one thing. The Vice President can only do one thing. If the vote is tied, if 50 senators vote one way and 50 senators vote another way, the Vice President can break that tie. Otherwise, the Vice President does nothing. They have no job. And John Adams once said that the Vice Presidency was one of the most pointless jobs in the world. Now, there's also somebody called the President Pro Tem or Tempore of the Senate. This is just a figurehead position. It really has no power. Okay, so one big idea I'm going to tell you right now. The Speaker of the House is a much more powerful position than the President Pro Tem or the Vice President of the Senate. The Speaker of the House can actually basically cut people off and make them stop speaking, and they have a lot of other powers to appoint people to certain committees. Whereas in the Senate, not so much. The President Pro Tem is just the person from the majority party that has really just served the longest time as a senator. They really have no power. Okay, we'll get into impeachment in a separate lesson, but in Article 1, it talks about impeachment, and basically the House of Representatives can vote to impeach or remove a public official. People always think impeachment deals with the president, but actually you can impeach any federal official. You can impeach a vice president, a judge, anybody in charge of a different cabinet level agencies, just any government official. Now, in order to be impeached, half of these 435 representatives have to say, we want to impeach. So it's a majority vote, simple majority. Then the articles of impeachment are sent to the Senate. All right, in the Senate, 2/3 of the senators have to agree to impeach. They have a vote. Now, obviously, that's a very difficult number to get, and this is why no president has been successfully impeached. Now, 3 different presidents have been impeached by the House. The articles of impeachment have been sent to the Senate, but all 3 were found not guilty by the Senate. So Trump, Clinton, and Andrew Johnson. People always say, well, what about Nixon? What about him? Well, Nixon actually resigned before he could be impeached. He knew it was coming. Okay? All right, now those are the basic structure and the basic requirements of the legislative branch. Let's look at the powers. This is what you have to know. I would say you need to know most of these things. These are the powers the government has. These are called enumerated powers or delegated powers. What that means is they are written in the Constitution. We use this term a lot, enumerated. So the government does have the power to collect taxes and borrow money from other countries and its own people. The big one is it can regulate commerce between states and with foreign powers. This is called the Commerce Clause. Extremely important. You must know this. We will go over that a lot more. They can make money, coin money. Obviously punish counterfeiters. So if you are a counterfeiter, it is a federal crime, not a state crime. Post offices, patent laws, they can establish courts inferior to the Supreme Court. We'll get into that later. That's actually important. They can punish basically pirates. Think of the Coast Guard, right? They can declare war, which has only been done a few times. They can raise and support armies and navies and call it the militia. So here's the really interesting thing. If you look at all these powers, most of these are very specific. And people say, well, Mr. Dreyer, today it seems like the government can do just about anything. So what does some of this stuff have to do with commerce? Well, we'll learn later that they've used this Commerce Clause to actually apply to many, many different things. And they've sort of decided that commerce can even be a plane flying from one state to another. It's carrying people. It's commerce. It could be some sort of boat going from one state to another, any sort of interstate highways. It could be a semi-truck full of stuff going between states, which gives the government a ton of power to regulate all of those things, which we'll talk about later. So probably the most important power here is the power to regulate interstate commerce and commerce between nations. All right, the people, when they were writing the Constitution, said, you know what? What if we forgot an important power? We made a list of all of these powers, but what if we forgot something? Or what if we need to pass some law related to these powers? But we didn't say it specifically in this list. And that is why they came up with a clause, which is very important, called the Necessary and Proper Clause. The necessary and proper clause says the federal government can make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. So, this is also called implied powers. It's implied that the government has these powers, or the elastic clause, because it can be bent, it's flexible. And this is really where most of the debate about the powers of the government comes in, right here. This is the powers that the states argue. This is the power that localities argue. It's the implied powers. You can't argue the government's power to make money. It says it right here. You can't argue their power to collect taxes or borrow money. It says it. And so they thought, you know what? All right, well, for example, regulate commerce. They're like, well, if we can regulate commerce, that means that we can do certain things like set regulations for steamboats. We could set safety regulations for a steamboat going from carrying people from one state to the next. That's related to commerce. We could do that. Well, you see, there's nothing in here that says you can set the regulations for steamboats. It's not an enumerated power. It's not listed. But the government could argue it's implied. It's necessary and proper. We need to have this power in order to regulate commerce. We'll get into this court case later, but basically the argument was a federal bank. There's nothing in here that says the government can make a federal bank. States can make banks, but there's no federal bank. And people said, look, it's not a power. You cannot do it. But the government argued that if you can coin money, if you can borrow money and collect taxes, you need to have a bank. This is something that is necessary in order to do these things. So they argued, yeah, we can make a bank. We should have the power. Okay, but normally a court has to then decide whether they have that power or not. So that's basically most of the stuff in Article 1. Remember, Article 1, legislative branch. Article 2 is going to be the executive, the presidency, and Article 3 is going to be the courts. So you already see that the first three parts of the Constitution, the first three chapters, talk about the three branches, the three major parts. And actually, Article 1 is the longest article in the Constitution. If you go from 1 to 7, it actually gets shorter as you go along. Everything is in Article 1 practically. Article 2 is shorter, 3 is shorter than that, it gets shorter and shorter and shorter. And that kind of goes to show that the Founding Fathers thought that the legislative branch was probably the most important branch. It was the one elected by the people, at least the representatives. The senators were not directly elected back then. Okay, the senators were chosen by the state legislatures. Only people directly elected in any of this are the representatives. All right, remember the president is not really directly elected. There's the entire electoral college system in place back then. And back then the electors were yet again chosen by the state legislatures. Now the electors are chosen based on popular vote, so the president is elected. And of course, judges have never been elected. Okay, Article 2 is about the executive branch, or basically the president. But keep in mind, the executive branch is not just the president. The executive branch is this entire part of the federal government. Nowadays, it's all the federal agencies that we think of. The president is in charge of all of those agencies. So the president's power has grown over time. Now, yet again, in Article 2, it talks about the powers of the president. First of all, to be a president, you have to be 35 years old, and you have to be a natural-born citizen of the United States. So I always tell people, remember, 25 for representative, 30 for senator, 35 for president. Okay? Yet again, it enumerates or lists the powers of the president. Here are the powers the president has in the Constitution. The president can carry out the laws passed by Congress. So Congress has to pass a law, then the president is supposed to have the power of implementing the law. The president is commander-in-chief of the military. And think about it. Back then they were worried that a general would take over. And so they said, well, if a civilian, the president, controls the military, it will make it harder to have a military coup. The president can grant pardons, but only for people who've been convicted of a federal crime, which we will talk about later. So if someone's convicted of a crime at a state level, the president cannot pardon them. It must be a federal crime. The president can appoint a cabinet. It can negotiate treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate. So 2/3 of the Senate must agree with any treaty the president negotiates with any country. So 2/3 of 100. And the president can appoint ambassadors and also judges. But yet again, judges have to be approved by the Senate. Judges only have to be approved by a vote of half. So 51 senators. Really what you see here is the president has a lot of power over foreign policy, dealing with other countries, because he can appoint ambassadors, negotiate treaties, deal with the military. And we'll get into that later. Article 3 is the judicial branch. Okay, this is actually a very short branch. Today we think of the Supreme Court as a very powerful part of the government. Nowadays, there's not just a Supreme Court. There's courts beneath the Supreme Court. Okay? And that's because more courts have been added over time to deal with more cases. Really, the Article 3, the judicial branch, is very, very short. It just says that the Supreme Court can deal with cases on the ocean, maritime cases, cases between states, say one state sues another state, or some case when the U.S. gets involved. We're going to go over the courts a lot more later, the judicial branch, because over time the power has grown a lot. But notice that the power of judicial review is not in here. It is not in the Constitution. Judicial review is the power of the court to look at a law passed by the government. It could also be a state government, and they can say this law is not constitutional. It does not follow the Constitution, and therefore you cannot have it. Basically, it's striking down a law. We're going to go into that more later, but it's not in the Constitution. This developed over time, and this is actually what gives the Supreme Court and the federal courts a lot of power today. If the courts did not have judicial review, they would really not have much power at all. Okay, Article 4 is all about states dealing with states, interstate relations, and there's a few clauses and things in here that are important that I would ask you about. One thing is a full faith and credit clause. Really what this means is any sort of legal documents in one state are going to be or should be honored in a different state. So if you're married in one state and you go to a different state, you're still married, even though the marriage certificate is by a state, all right? And there's a bunch of other things, like a driver's license nowadays in one state is valid in all states. Privileges and immunities really just says that back then, if you're a Virginian and you go to North Carolina can't pass laws treating you differently. They can't say, well, this law, there's a different law for everybody who's a Virginian that just came here. So they really have to treat everybody about the same. Now, of course, they didn't do this because of slavery. But back then, obviously, slaves were not considered citizens. They also didn't do it because sometimes they didn't treat free African Americans equally. So just because it says it in the Constitution doesn't mean people actually necessarily did it all the time. There's the fugitive slave clause that we talked about earlier that was in there. Now, later on, this gets deleted from the Constitution, but it's in there when it's written. Okay, Article 5 is just about how do you change the Constitution? How do you amend the Constitution, which I'll make a little video about. Article 6 has a clause called the Supremacy Clause. What that says is the federal government, any law passed by the federal government, is supreme over the law of the states. So no state can say, well, we don't want to follow that federal law. Now think about it. If a state could not follow a federal law, it would make the Constitution and the federal government very weak. States have to follow federal laws. That's why the Supremacy Clause is in here. And really what they were trying to do was reverse the weakness of the Articles of Confederation. Remember, the Articles of Confederation were very weak. because the national government had no powers. They couldn't enforce any of their laws. So this is a way of trying to fix that. Article 7 is just a basic sort of how do we ratify the Constitution? And I already made a video on that. To ratify the Constitution, 9 of the 13 states had to vote in the state legislatures to ratify the Constitution, and then it would take effect. So really, you don't have to worry about this much. On a test or a quiz, the articles you really need to know are 1, through 3. Those are the big ones: legislative branch, executive branch, judicial branch. And I'm going to ask you the bulk of the questions on the legislative branch because that has the most information in there. So, in the PowerPoint, I list the enumerated powers. And I have a separate PowerPoint on different powers. You must know these. I also talk about the necessary and proper clause and the elastic clause, which you also must know. This is very important. You have to know the powers of the president. Backing up, I missed a slide. Well, let's back up. There's also some powers the federal government cannot do. Okay, at the end of Article 1, it talks about the powers the legislative branch can do, and then it talks about some powers they cannot do. These are called forbidden powers. All right, so they cannot deny habeas corpus, except in cases of rebellion or invasion. Habeas corpus is a vocab term, but basically it means that the government cannot throw you into prison without telling you the crime that you are charged with. And you're thinking, how would that ever happen? Because today that wouldn't happen. But for example, let's just say back in the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln thought, wow, these people here might be Confederate sympathizers. I don't really have a lot of evidence, but it might be true. Let's just arrest them. So he would, maybe you're thrown in prison and you're not really even told the charge and you're not even given a trial. Can't do that. Now, Abraham Lincoln, it's argued, could do that because it was a rebellion. Ex post facto laws. The government cannot make a law. Let's just say in Virginia, they made a law right now that said, drinking soda is illegal. And you drank a soda last week before the law was even actually a law. Then they came back and arrest you. They can't do that. They can't make a law after the fact. They can't hold you accountable after they make a law. A bill of attainder is arresting an entire group of people and throwing them in prison with no trial, with no reason. So this is a little bit different than habeas corpus because this is sort of a single person they're not really told what they're being arrested for. This is an entire group of people. This has really never happened in the history of the United States. It did happen in England before, and that's why they put it in the Constitution. The federal government cannot prefer one state over another in commerce. So they can't pass a law that actually treats one state better than another state. And I always show this in here just because it's interesting. Nobody can be a noble in the United States. There are no titles of nobility. Even George Washington couldn't be a noble. It's prohibited in the Constitution. So nobody can be a king or a baron or a viscount. Okay? So that's the basic stuff in the Constitution. Look, you're required to know more, but if you know this stuff here, you're going to be pretty set. I would ask you these vocab words or questions about these things. I would ask you about the enumerated powers. I would ask you about the elastic clause. I would ask you about the powers of the president. Okay? All right, well, I hope that helped. If you have any questions, let me know.